Welcome to A Billion Realities. Here's your host, Jessica Gerlach.
Welcome back to A Billion Realities. Today we have a very special guest. She is a renowned psychologist, author, international speaker, and the host of Love and Life podcast. Dr. Karin, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jessica. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you on today. I've been following you and all of your insights into relationships for a while now. So where are you joining us from today?
From my house on lockdown, like everyone. I'm just outside of Chicago, though.
Oh, okay, great. I wasn't sure exactly where you were located. Yeah, everybody's on lockdown. Well, it's great to have you on. Thanks for joining us. So today, guys, we're talking about, today we're talking about toxic relationships, the dynamics of them, factors such as codependency, trauma bonding, and the different types of abuse that can be present in this type of cycle. So let me ask you this. What defines a toxic relationship?
Well, a toxic relationship, that's a great question. I don't know if there's any kind of standard definition in the field, but really a toxic relationship would be, to my mind, any relationship that is not enhancing and edifying both people emotionally, psychologically. If you're in a relationship that is tearing either of you down in any way, lowering your self-esteem, contributing to bad habits that you have, bringing out the worst in you rather than the best in you, to me, that's toxic.
Absolutely. I agree. And a lot of the time, it is a dynamic between two people. It's not always just the one person. It becomes toxic for both people. I have noticed that. You know, sometimes there is one person that is a little more on the abusive side, but that's an interesting question and answer, from you. So oftentimes the family or friends of a person that is in a toxic or abusive relationship cannot understand when looking from why the person stays in it for so long. So can you explain why people stay for so long when it's clearly damaging and unhappy?
Well, it's really, there's so many reasons. There are many, many variables that can be at work. We can start with the basic stuff that I talk about a lot, single shaming. People in our culture, essentially, we look at people who are in relationships as normal, that's appropriate, that's expected, especially after you reach a certain age. In our grandparents' time, by the time they were 22, if they weren't married, they were old maids, right? So we have a lot of societal pressure, and we look at singles. That's why there's the term single shaming, singleism. There's this expectation that if you haven't found anybody, what's wrong with you? That's what my entire book is about. So we can start with the very basic, very basic realities that people expect you to be in relationships. And, of course, then there's the desire. I think most of us, I think the percentage is about 98% of the population eventually marries at some point. Whether they stay married, that's a different story. But so we do have, probably biologically, we are meant to live in community. So we desire connection, intimacy. So it's internal, it's external. And then when you get to the part of toxic, sometimes people really struggle because they've started in relationships when they were younger, frankly, when their brains haven't fully formed. The latest neurological research shows that our brains don't fully mature until our mid-20s, and for men, later than that, actually late 20s. So you think about it, some girl who had her first boyfriend at 14, 15, she's continued to be in relationships. So she's evolved. Her development has been in conjunction with another person. She hasn't even been able to cultivate her own independent identity. So then getting back to a more kind of a psychoanalytic perspective, maybe there's some things that happened in her childhood that were unhealthy, right? Some dysfunctional family dynamics. Maybe her father was unavailable. So here now, as she's grown up and she's starting relationships, oftentimes we go to what is comfortable and familiar, even when it's unhealthy and toxic. So we have people then who they stay with something because it feels normal to them. And even though their friends are like, oh my gosh, girl, you can do so much better, and their family worries about them, they're playing out the script that maybe happened when they were in childhood, and they've never been an adult, independent adult, to get some space from relationships to figure out who they are and to cultivate that sense of identity and self-esteem that wouldn't put up with that crap.
Right, that makes sense. So we repeat a lot of what we saw and what we're used to, whatever is familiar. So we know that a lot of those dynamics involve abuse. So can you elaborate on the different types of abuse, and what do the cycles of abuse look like? Are they different with each type of abuse?
Well, I mean, I guess, are you talking about whether it's physical versus emotional abuse? Is that what you mean?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, yes. I have not come across, and I don't consider myself an abuse expert, and I'm sure that there's a lot of researchers who focus on that. But what I've come across is that there's a pretty basic cycle of abuse that works. Essentially, it's in place for any type of abusive dynamic we're talking about. And it starts with this wooing, and they call it the honeymoon phase, and he's going to win you over. And then you have a period where things are going smoothly, and then the incident occurs, whether it's the verbal abuse, the emotional or physical abuse, or sexual abuse even. And then there's the pulling back because, of course, she's hurt. And it's, again, I'm using a stereotypical with a male perpetrator, but it doesn't always happen that way. And then she pulls back, and then she says, maybe she makes a decision in her head, I'm done with this, forget it. But then as she tries to pull away, then he comes running back, I'm so sorry, and the flowers and the poetry. And then she goes, okay, and she forgives them. And then they get back into like a period of calm, and then the cycle just continues to repeat itself. And it is so painful to watch someone in that, for sure. When you're talking about watching someone from the outside, it's very, very painful, and you feel so helpless to help.
Absolutely. So many of us know emotional abuse can be one of the toughest to identify, especially early on, I believe. In your experience, do you feel that people have unclear perceptions or boundaries of what abuse is and what's acceptable and what's not when it comes to emotional abuse?
Yeah, I think it's really well put. You mentioned boundaries. And again, if we're talking about someone who's come from a household, and all families have their dysfunction. It's not like anybody comes from a perfect household, but there are definitely degrees of dysfunction. And if someone comes from a family where boundaries were not respected, and where the family members, you have parents who belittle children. I mean, some kids hear the worst stuff. I mean, physical abuse, sexual abuse, obviously, and then emotional abuse, such as, like, I wish you'd never been born. You ruined my life. I had my whole life ahead of me, and then I got knocked up with you, and now my life is over, and it's all your fault. I mean, kids hear things that we can't even fathom. I mean, you read about it and you're
right.
to tears. My first job as a therapist was in child welfare. So that was working with foster children in the south side of Chicago. So it was all kids, and you obviously know kids get into the foster care system because they've been abused in one way, shape, or form. And I would read their case files, and I was like 24 years old and, right out of school, and I'm going to save the world. And it was just heartbreaking. And then you'd have, because it was poverty, so a mother might be desperate to have a man to help financially. So she'd bring a guy into the home, and then he would abuse the children, her children, and she wouldn't even protect them. I mean, it's just unfathomable. But yeah, the emotional piece is hard to see, because if you've been told since you were little that you're worth nothing, if, again, like the example I just brought up, if your mother brought a man into the home to help pay some bills and let him abuse you physically, emotionally, sexually, you don't think you're worth anything else. It's for you, the idea of someone to treat you well and with respect, that's like a fairy tale. I mean, that's just maybe you see it in the movies, and that just doesn't seem like real life. And so for you to identify, like you're saying earlier, even to identify this is abusive, very hard for people to see it when that's all that they've known.
That makes complete sense. And that brings me to another interesting topic, and I have only discovered this in the last few years, which is a trauma bond. So if you could shed some light onto what a trauma bond is, that would be amazing.
Yeah, I saw the post you did today, which I thought was really, I don't know where you got that, but that was some great information. But a trauma bond, the problem, yeah, it was great. A trauma bond is essentially a bond that happens, and like it says, it's because of trauma. Now, there's a couple different types. You could have a trauma bond that would be a little bit less pathological, and I say less like pathological, like less debilitating for both members. For example, this is a true story that happened. This is before your generation, but way back, like before Gigi Hadid, there was this woman named Christy Brinkley, right? So she's a really famous model. She's probably in her 60s now. But in my generation, she was like one. You do? Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm going to bring this as an example, but I don't know if her listeners will know. But just think Gigi Hadid, like a couple years ago. And she used to be married to Billy Joel, which your listeners' parents would like Billy Joel. But anyway, but she, after Billy Joel, she was divorced, but then she was doing this helicopter skiing, and where they take you up in the helicopter at the top of the mountain and then drop you off so you can see these really cool runs that you can't access with lifts. And the helicopter went down at the top of the mountain. It crashed into the mountain. And she was with this other guy who was also skiing, some guy she did not know. Well, because they were there for several hours before they were rescued, it was this traumatic thing. And then come to find out, a couple weeks later, they're dating. And then a couple months later, it was really quick, they're married. Well, they were passionately in love, but the bond was because of the trauma that they both experienced, and I don't think the marriage even lasted a year. So that would be like a more benign, like, okay, well, it wasn't that big of a deal, but it was a trauma bond. Really, they basically misinterpreted their physiological response, right? Their physiological response was stress and hormones, cortisols are racing, and they're feeling all these emotions. And then they're starting to attribute it to, I must be in love with this guy. Well, it's really more that your body was in panic mode because you guys almost died. But
so
the
chemical.
Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, yeah.
No, go ahead.
So that makes sense because it's the chemical reaction that deceived them, basically.
Exactly, right. So it's confusing, and it's actually there's other research that shows that happens. But a trauma bond with a more toxic situation could be, again, like you were showing in your slides, but the idea in your post today, but the idea that essentially your brain is wired to, and I love this, and it's important to remember for all of us, your brain is wired not to make you happy. Your brain is wired to keep you alive, which is one of the reasons that people have anxiety, right? Because your brain is wanting you to think there's fear, there's danger, stay inside, don't be with that person. Don't go talk to those people over there. They're going to laugh at you, they're going to make fun of you, your social anxiety. Our brain is trying to protect us at all times. And so even with a trauma bond, with what happens is when people have been in childhood, if they've experienced this trauma and abuse and emotional abuse, they perceive that's how then they know, well, they learn, parents love their children. Well, this is how my dad treated me, so that must be love. So, and because, again, they were forced in childhood to stay with they were still dependent on their parents, even though their parents treated them like crap, they're still dependent on them for survival. So they've learned that, well, yeah, you just got to put up with this. This pain is just part of love, and that still, if I'm not with this person, I could die. The brain literally is thinking these irrational thoughts because that's all it knows.
Wow, that's very interesting. So is it a similar or the same dynamic when you have an abusive relationship amongst two adults and, one person is abusive? The person who's abused, is the trauma bond the experience for the abused person only, or is it's for both of them?
Interesting question. That's interesting. I think the bonding, and I don't know if it's always a trauma bond. If we think about every abusive relationship, I don't know that they would all fall under a trauma bond scenario. Sometimes abuse can just be, think of it, let's think of a kid who grew up in a home where the dad was very critical and shaming and bullied, right? The kid was bullied by his dad. What happens when kids are abused in that manner? They typically do one of two things. They either go in one or two major directions. Either they go all the way in the end of trying to they end up super passive, right? Because to save himself, again, this is something that a child does to survive. I'm never going to pop off. I'm never going to speak my mind, because when I did that at home, I got bullied and criticized by my father. And I just wanted to like pull back and be as small as possible so I can stay out of harm's way. Or else they become the bully themselves. And this we see with school bullying as well. So what happens is that as the person grows older, now he's learned, well, okay, I took so much crap from my dad as a kid. Now I'm going to be in control. It's a way to try to take control of what happened in the past, even though it doesn't satisfy or correct or heal the wound that he experienced as a child. But now in adulthood, he's like, okay, I will never be bullied again. And the only way to not be bullied is to be a bully yourself. So then he's going to pick someone in a relationship who he can dominate, right? Mm-hmm. And so he's going to look for that. He would find someone, a woman with strong strength, high self-esteem, and independence. He would not be attracted to her. No way. He's going to pass her by. But he'll find someone who, again, because their pathologies meld, maybe she was also criticized. And again, maybe she has experienced that where she feels that her self-esteem has been so damaged as a child that she feels the only way that she can survive is to find someone who she sees as strong and opinionated and will take charge and take control. Well, the sneaky, ugly underbelly of that is that she'll also be dominated, and she'll also be probably emotionally abused and ripped and torn down and ripped apart emotionally, but that will seem normal and fit for her because of what she went through. So again, it won't necessarily be a trauma bond for each scenario, but you're going to see that the reason that they work is because it fits both of their history of pain and pathology and dysfunction, and that's why it works in adulthood.
That's very interesting. So I know in some cases that a woman, or let's just use this example. It can go either way, of course, just like you said before. So let's say a woman is, in an abusive dynamic with a man, and at some point, well, let's say throughout the relationship, she's a little more, submissive or putting up with his antics, and then the abuse increases and she's putting up with it, let's say for, a couple of years. And then she, I've had enough, and she walks away. And sometimes they do get to that point, even though they had put up with it for so long. You'll see someone finally break free, and everybody will be like, oh, finally, like their family and friends. But then they'll break up and even take space and separate for a while, and they'll still go back. So what is it that brings them back after a break, even a breakup for let's say it's a couple of months? What brings them back? And if they don't go back to him, very often they go back to someone who's just as bad or the same. It's like a woman will marry 3 different alcoholics. It just doesn't change. What brings them back is, again, they haven't, and this is so painful for folks who, we have a friend who worked quite a bit with doing volunteer work for domestic violence shelters. It's very painful for those workers because they provide this shelter, they provide support for the kids, but you will have cases where those women, they will come in and they'll take maybe a week or 2, and they'll be thankful for the therapy they got and for the food and the shelter, and when they leave, they go right back. I mean, it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking. So I don't think there's an easy answer to this, but I think it just speaks to what we've talked about before. When someone has, sadly, and this is why I advocate so much, one of my platforms is very much for singles to go with single shaming, to stand strong, because our time alone is so important for us as adults to have that time and space to start looking a little bit and get that distance from childhood so we can go, okay, here I am as an adult, and whatever happened to me in my childhood was hideous perhaps. I mean, I hope it wasn't for most of us, but many of us it was. It was hideous. It was painful. It was not healthy, and I've got to take some time now as an adult on my own to take care of that. Go to therapy, read self-help books, listen to programs like yours. I've got to find some healing, because if I don't, I know for a fact I will be pointing in the wrong direction when it comes to relationships. And so, again, many of these women, like we talked about earlier, if you started dating at 14 and you've really not had a break since you were 14, you've had no adult time to get some
sense of self and build, if you need to build that self-esteem on your own so that you can then see, because if you don't have that self-esteem in place, if you don't understand that healthy relationships are in fact possible, if your parents were really, really rough with you, you are not going to be able to break away, because that is still going to feel like love until you can get some distance and truly work on yourself. And it sounds so cliche, but there's no magic wand for it. You just have to do that kind of work.
I can absolutely understand what you're saying, and I've seen those examples, and I've experienced some of that myself. It's not until we do the inner work and go through the healing process and rebuild ourselves after being hurt, however many times, that we can start choosing a healthier dynamic for ourselves and understand that it's, out of self-love, really, what we're going to put up with and what we won't put up with. So that makes a lot of sense. So I think that's great advice for our listeners, to take some time alone, do your healing, and if it's therapy, combines, a lot of meditation works for a lot of people as well, any type of, psychological therapy, and I feel like a lot of spiritual work is really helpful for a lot of people too. Do you feel that if people were better educated on the cycles of abuse and trauma bonds, that they would be able to pull themselves out quicker?
I mean, I'd love to say that an education, in psych, we talk about psychoeducation and just trying to help people understand what's normal and what's not. And when I say normal, I mean, because a lot of times people pathologize things that are very normal. Like right now, like I'm doing a lot of stuff about being under quarantine and COVID, and like no one is going to feel normal. So if we're running around like, I don't know why I feel so off today. Why am I so depressed and anxious? It's like, because there's a global pandemic. That is why. It's not abnormal to feel off right now. That's what I mean when I say normal. But we try to educate about psychological states, and the problem with this is that it's kind of a head versus heart, right? It's the intellectual knowledge doesn't always translate into an emotional knowledge, and even in therapy, we talk about insight does not always equal change. And that's really disappointing for therapists, because if you're in therapy with a client and they have an aha moment, right? And they're like, I see it. I get that I'm with this guy because he reminds me of my abusive father. And he's also abusive. So, I guess that's the reason. It doesn't mean that they'll necessarily leave him that day. Unfortunately, right. I agree with what you're saying in the sense that more knowledge is better. I guess the caveat to that would be if you have a friend and you're like, hey, let's go and next time, whenever we're able to hang out again, let's go get a cup of coffee. And you pull out your textbook and here's the cycle of abuse. And do you see what you're doing? And she doesn't immediately leave that guy. Don't be disappointed. You can plant the seed, but she's still going to have to come to her own conclusion when she's ready.
I love that insight, and I feel like it makes so much sense. You have information, which is mental, and then, like you said, the emotional aspect of it, it requires emotional intelligence and emotional evolution and self-love and all of that. So that makes sense. So let's talk about codependency. This is something that I see everywhere now, and only in the last few years I've learned about that as well. So what makes a person codependent, and what is that in a relationship?
And I'm glad you brought this up, because there's actually a lot of misinformation. People think of codependent as just enmeshed, which I recently did a post on my Instagram about enmeshment, because, again, it's something that comes from childhood a lot, and I'm a big fan of being interdependent. So you're two people who have very independent, distinct senses of self, who choose to come together, not because either one needs the other person, but who choose to have a healthy, mutually beneficial relationship. So, but enmeshment is when people are basically needing each other to survive, but it's not the same as codependent. And I'm so glad you brought this up, because I want to really shed a little light on this. So codependent is actually more nuanced than just two people who are fused together and don't have any identity apart from each other. Codependent is more extreme. It comes from the addictions literature. And here's what it looks like. So you see, let's go back to the alcoholic, because that's the classic addict, right, that we've been trying to deal with for years and years and years. And AA makes great strides, and people have a lot of recovery possibilities through that and their research and their models. And they actually do a lot of this with their Al-Anon, which is their like if you are a family member or a partner of an alcoholic, this is where you would learn about this codependency. So what happens is the addict has their devil, right, their vice, that is their addiction, the alcohol. And when you get into a relationship with an addict, and it's hard to say which comes first, the chicken or the egg here, but if you stay with this person for very long, you're going to end up codependent. And here's the point that's really interesting, such that when the alcoholism is full-blown and the addict has a relationship with alcohol that really supersedes any other relationship in their life, and this can be cocaine or it can be meth or whatever other addiction you want to go with, Oxycontin, all the prescription addictions as well. But what happens is if the relationship survives, there's going to be a codependent element. And what that means is that, say I'm the wife of an alcoholic, as much as I would say to everyone around me, I wish he'd get clean, I wish he'd get sober, I need him to get sober, I will, without realizing it, I will be doing things to support his addiction, what they call enable his addiction. I will keep him a drunk. It's crazy, I know. It sounds crazy, but this is what happens. So it will be things like giving him, putting up with his excuses. Well, right, taking his excuses. When he drinks, I will somehow, some way allow it cognitively and emotionally. And the codependent element that's really fascinating and very sad is that when we look at the dynamic of the couple, what happens is she needs him to be a drunk because she needs to feel superior. Like he's the one with the problem. I'm not a drunk. You're the drunk. I have it together. You don't. And if he got sober, that dynamic would be out of whack. So she needs him to stay sick so she can feel superior, or so she can feel needed. Because if she were with a healthy man, he wouldn't be sick and troubled and he wouldn't need her. And down deep, she believes that she is only good enough to be with an unhealthy addict.
That is some very deep, deep insight. So,
right?
Yeah, it really is.
Like, so sad, yeah.
It is sad. And do you feel that with a codependent situation, such as that or any of the other ones that exist, and other dynamics is what I mean, is it also the case that enablers, they enable to keep the person in the relationship as well because they fear that if the person gets better, they might leave them?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Okay. And that's a great, another great example of that comes to mind when you say that is someone who's obese, someone who's with them. And obesity is just a huge health concern. I mean, I'm not even talking about body shaming. That is not my intention here. I'm talking about the fact that if you look, being obese is like, you can smoke like 3 packs a day and not die as quickly as someone who's obese, right? It's horrible on your body. But so someone who would continue going through McDonald's drive-thru and buying 20 Big Macs for their partner every day because they're afraid if you get healthy and get skinny, you'll leave me. Yeah, absolutely. It's to maintain a relationship.
Yeah. Have absolutely seen that. So what type of childhoods do codependent adults come from typically? Is it an issue from childhood as well?
I think everything has something. It goes back to childhood. That's interesting. That's an interesting question. I have not looked at the literature to see what the codependent childhood looks like. There's a great book for anyone who's interested because I think that I want to say that just say you dated an alcoholic or dated a guy who messed around with drugs or whatever, it doesn't mean you were codependent. It means alcoholics, addicts are very charming. If you stayed with the guy for 10 years and he was an addict the entire time, then yes, I would say you're codependent. But just to date someone for a couple months or like 6 months and be like, I'm out of here, right? If you left, don't go around labeling yourself into codependent. You got out. So you're not. So I just want to make sure, like I said earlier, I want to make sure we don't pathologize because everyone's like, oh my gosh, I dated this guy for 8 months and I realized he was an addict and then we broke up. Am I codependent? No, you're not. But back to a codependent, if someone wants to understand more fully, there's a great book called Codependent No More by Melanie Beattie. It's an old book, probably like from the 80s, but it's one of those books that really was groundbreaking in shedding light on the codependent and the addict dynamic, and it's very, very helpful. And actually, it's funny, I was talking about this on an Instagram Live I was doing last weekend, and someone was like, I'm reading that book, and they were, the people watching were like kind of, you know how you can make comments on Instagram Live? They were commenting to each other and sharing resources, and I was like, that's great, because that book is still very groundbreaking. But I would imagine, again, anyone, it goes back to these, any kind of shaming childhood, any kind of overly critical childhood where a child felt, I'm not worthy. So I grow up and I see someone who's the wounded bird, right, the broken limb you think of. And so that addict has that tragic flaw, but I feel I can be with him because he is tragic, you know, once they realize it. And this is not conscious either. It's not like anyone is having this conversation in their head. It's just these dynamics start to move them in that direction, and they feel safe and comfortable because, well, he'll never leave me because he's messed up. He's an addict. So I'll feel safe that he will never leave me. There's a security there.
Wow. That's deep as well. It's complex. It's very complex stuff, you know, and the fact that it comes from our childhood makes it that much more difficult to understand and to process and to do something about it, right? So what types of therapy, you know, can be done on somebody who's just leaving, like freshly out of a really toxic dynamic or just left an abuser? What type of therapy do they get?
Yeah, I'm just a big fan of cognitive behavioral therapy. The cognitive therapies are the ones, you know, the theme of my podcast is take charge of your thoughts, take charge of your life, because we know that, let's say you're having a bad day and you're feeling like I'm depressed. Well, if you think about underneath that feeling, there is a thought that is sustaining that feeling. If I'm thinking happy thoughts, like, wow, it's a beautiful day. Like, wow, I got my whole life ahead of me. I'm not feeling bad, am I? Right? But if I'm feeling, if I'm thinking really negative thoughts, that's going to fuel that sad feeling. And so, and then you go beneath the thought, and there's a meaning that we ascribe to circumstances. So, someone who was just breaking it off from an addict or something, the thought that they may be feeling totally depressed. Listen, I've been through so many breakups personally. Breaking up is hideous. It's so hard, which is another reason I love being in the space that I'm in, trying to support my community with support for breakups and such. But when you go through a breakup, you're going to have thoughts that are going to be, you're going to feel sad. But one thought that could be fueling your breakup could be, oh my gosh, I was with this addict. That means I'm codependent. I'm a complete train wreck. Oh my gosh, this is it. I'm always going to be doomed to fall in love with guys who are no good for me. I'm going to be in one toxic relationship after another. Like, those are kind of thoughts that are going to keep you depressed, right? And you will be like going nowhere, right? So, and a cognitive behavioral therapist, a cognitive behavioral therapist is going to get in there and start trying to help you examine those thoughts and help you reframe any thoughts that aren't serving you. And they're going to say, no, you just broke up with someone, and if you were that codependent, you would have stayed with them. You would have kept staying in that relationship. You didn't. So come on, you got to look at your strengths here. They're going to help you look at that keeping you stuck, and they're going to help you challenge that thought and go, you know what, that's not necessarily true. You know, I have a lot of people in my community, Jessica, you know this from my stuff that I do. They are fearful of being single for forever. Well, if you're running around saying, I'm going to be single for forever, you are going to be miserable and you're going to have no hope, and you're probably going to be walking around with a cloud over your head, and you won't even understand that that's going to send out this kind of message and this energy to people that you interact with that, wow, this girl, she's a kind of lost hope, and that's not going to be attractive. It's not going to be showing your best self. So really tackling those thoughts is my favorite therapy. So cognitive therapy is one I recommend. Another, a third generation cognitive therapy is called ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy. And you mentioned meditation. It's very much grounded. It's a little bit like cognitive therapy that I love is more like I get into the ring with my thoughts. If I have a stupid thought, I'm like, you're being stupid. And I put up my dukes and I'm like, I'm going to take you down, dumb thought. Like, that's just my personality. So I get in there, I get in the ring with my thought, and I'm like, you're being irrational. You better stop it. And then I make myself be rational. But there's another process that some of your listeners may more resonate with, which would be, it's more meditative. And you create distance, you defuse from your thoughts so that you can kind of get space there. and a thought that's troubling you, that's maybe ruminating, like I'll be single forever, or the next guy I date's going to be an addict too, I know because I'm codependent. You get distance from that thought. You watch that thought and you watch the feelings that accompany that thought. You watch it float down the stream, like visually in your mind, like a leaf floating down a stream. And it's a little more woo-woo, but I really dig it. And in fact, I had the creator of ACT on my podcast. And it's a podcast, I can't remember which episode, it was like 60-something. It's called Liberate Your Mind from Depression and Anxiety, because his most recent book was published last fall, and it's called Liberate Your Mind. And it's amazing. He created this therapy because he himself suffered from panic attacks. So this is a heavy-duty therapy that can help you tackle and manage very, very acute conditions. So for anyone who's interested in that, those are my two favorites. It's cognitive behavioral therapy, and then ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. And then I also love family systems. So if you think that, which we talked about, a lot of this comes from childhood. If you think that a lot of what you're going through in relationships, and maybe like you're talking about here, that codependency, it probably stems from your childhood. So a family therapist, ideally they get your whole family together, even in adulthood, which sounds like crazy, but it's so powerful. But if you can't get your whole family on board because, like, I don't know, your parents are like, we're not going to therapy with you, you're 28, you need to figure this out yourself. I would recommend a therapist who's at least well-versed in family systems, because they will be really helpful with that. Also, like I said, Al-Anon for codependency, these are support groups that you can go to. It's like 12-step programs, but it's for the people who are the codependent member of the relationship. Mm-hmm. And then also a therapist who has a CADC, which is a certification in addictions. They will be very well versed in how to treat addicts and also those who've been in relationships with addicts.
That's incredible. So that's all very interesting. Back to the grounding process. So I'm a hypnotist and I'm certified in NLP, and a lot of the hypnosis process is the same as what you were describing. It's very much like meditation, and I tell people that because sometimes when people hear hypnosis, they're like, "Oh, it's weird," you know?
Right.
But it's actually really just a form of meditation and bringing the person to kind of, separate from those, unhealthy thoughts, let's call them, and then get them to re-look or review the situation. Or if they suffered from a trauma in childhood, getting them to review it as an adult where they're not vulnerable, right? So I love that process. I think it's very effective, and it's also something that people can do on their own in addition to whatever other therapy that they're getting. So great advice. That's really. Well,
and I'm going to have you on my podcast to talk about NLP because I am super intrigued by it, but I don't know a ton. I keep seeing it. It's coming across my radar a lot. So I would love to learn more about NLP.
Okay, great. It's pretty interesting. The difference I find, with hypnosis, it's like you want to get to the root of the why. And with NLP, it's like, nope, we don't care why. We're just going to interrupt that pattern. It's very aggressive, not in a physically aggressive way, of course, but it's a different approach, but it's very effective. And a lot of therapists use that, combined with the traditional psychotherapy or whatever it is. But that's interesting because. So hypnosis, if you're saying about the why, that goes more like Freudian. It's psychoanalytic. Like we want to get back to before you were 2 years old and whatever happened, right? Whereas cognitive therapies would be more like NLP then, because cognitive therapies are like we're in the here and now, and whatever that faulty thought pattern came from, we're not as concerned with that. We just want to attack it now. I say attack because like I said, I'm more like. I like to duke it out with my thoughts, but we want to intervene now and give you some choices, challenge that thought, give you choices that would be more healthy and edifying. That's so awesome. So now I have an analogy, like the cognitive versus the traditional. But let me ask you this, because this is a hot topic as well, and I think that we've all dealt with this on some level. So narcissism. What do you do when you're in a relationship with somebody who's narcissistic? I hear that there's a spectrum scale, and from my understanding, there's definitely, a level of narcissist if they're not like a full-blown, NPD. So what type is that something that can change? Can a narcissist change?
Yeah, I love this question. I am so glad you're bringing this up, Jessica, because I know you're seeing the same stuff I am on social media. Like almost every girl who dated like a man who was mean to her now thinks she dated a narc. And I'm not trying to be insensitive, but we have to be careful. We are not diagnosing people with narcissistic personality disorder. That's a heavy duty. A personality disorder is something that is believed to have begun before the age of 2. Those are traits that are very resistant to therapy. These are people who are very, very unhealthy. Now, many people, like you said, there's a spectrum. Many people have dated guys with narcissistic traits. Yeah, because any guy who's a jerk or, anyone who is mean and selfish is going to have narcissistic traits. So I think it's important that we just differentiate. It's just important that we don't go around labeling people all the time. And it's just happening a lot on social media. And I just want people to be a little careful with the terms they're throwing around. Now, be that as it may, if you dated someone who had narcissistic traits, who was selfish and critical and tried to gaslight you and all these sorts of things, then again, there's a lot of accounts that are like, this narc did this narc did that. And I'm like, okay, but what can you do about it? If you've left him, how about we work on figuring out what it was within you that somehow, at least initially, found that attractive. Now, yes, they can be charming and they can pull the wool over your eyes for a couple months. So I'm not trying to minimize that they can really dupe you. But really, we don't have any power over changing anyone else. We only have power over changing ourselves. So to my mind, I'd love to see more emphasis on, let me examine what was going on with me that I stuck around with that narc for so long, if he was a narc or narcissistic personality traits that were in place. So let me see what it was about me that found that attractive and stuck with it.
Right. I think it's part of the abuse cycle, because narcissists, or people with those traits they are very abusive. But like you said, at what level is the person at? And depending on the person who was in the relationship with them and their knowledge on the subject, we can't call, they have to check a certain amount of the boxes, right, in order to kind of fit in that scenario. But, it's regardless, if it's abusive to you, you need to step away. And it doesn't even matter really necessarily what their label is. If it's toxic, it's toxic, and you need to get out of it. If it's abusive, it's abusive. And like you said, it takes a lot of self-reflection to figure out why you attracted that, like you said, and why you stayed in it. And it's funny because once you gain your self-worth or your confidence back and you decide, okay, I'm not putting up with that anymore, that's when the dynamic changes, because you're out of the cycle. You have to break the cycle because they're not going to change.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And especially if they are full-blown NPD, they're not changing. Like I said, they're highly resistant to change, even if they would go to therapy. And most of them aren't going to therapy because they don't want to go to therapy. They think they're doing just fine. Thank you very much. Yeah. So I'd like the focus to be on that, because there could be a codependent element. A narcissist can't abuse someone unless someone is taking the abuse. And that's harsh, and people don't like to hear that. They feel like I'm shaming the victim. I'm not shaming the victim. I just know that if we stay in that mindset, we are not empowered. But the only way to empower a victim is to let the victim know that they have it within themselves to not be a victim anymore.
Absolutely. So that brings me to another question. Let's say you are with a narcissist, and it is, it's been established that they are one. Let's say you're married to one and you have kids, and it's a difficult scenario to leave, or you don't want to leave and you want to go to therapy. What are the chances for a narcissist to say, yeah, I recognize my narcissistic traits, and to go through that process of therapy? Is it going to help them?
Yeah, like I said, if they are full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, it's not the prognosis is bleak. It's not good.
I thought so. Yeah.
I mean, I would send them to you. Hey, get hypnotized. Let's hope we. Honestly, I mean, I'd want I'd throw whatever you could at them, like if they were willing to go, but I don't even think they're going to go. So, I mean, that breaks my heart, especially if there's kids involved, like you said.
Right. The thing is, they can't see that they are. So how will they go to therapy? They rarely will say, "Okay, I see it," because that's what narcissism is. They can't be to blame or at fault for anything. So they absolutely, futile.
Yeah.
Futile. But I've seen the question pop up a lot, especially with people who they want to get the help for their marriage or their relationship, and I've seen actually the same thing that you just said. It's bleak, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So what happens in a narcissist's life that makes them that way? Because we know that they're not born. Narcissists aren't born that way, right? There's an emotional shutdown. Yeah.
So the personality disorders, that component of mentally ill, that criteria, they, like I said, they are formed before 2 years of age, and it would just be extreme emotional abuse to a little infant. Like, and you know, I don't know if you are familiar with borderline personality disorder, which is it's like the opposite of narcissist, but it's opposite in terms of the way it plays out. But it's what more men are diagnosed with NPD and more women are diagnosed with BPD. And the idea is that with BPD, it's interesting. And most of us have had friendships that have if you ever, this is an old movie, but Single White Female, where a friend, where a friend will try to almost take over your life. They become almost obsessed with a friend. And most of us have had friends that have been a little bit like too much. But they're probably not BPD. But sometimes if you have a friendship with someone who's BPD, they're so needy. It's black and white. Everything is so all-encompassing for them. They have no boundaries. And narcissists is similar in the sense that it's black and white. Like you love them or you hate them. You're all good or you're all bad. And for them, they're always all good and you're always all bad, right? And so the idea is that they are acting out the neediness of an infant, really. Like, they have the emotional needs of a 2-year-old because those needs were never met. So it could have been they cried and their mom yelled at them to shut up instead of rock them to sleep or gave them a bottle or whatever they needed. So their needs were so completely not met that they come into adulthood with these very infantile needs, right? So that's why the narcissist is like, have these needs of grandiosity, the way with 2-year-olds, like the terrible twos, right? Where they're so egocentric, it's all about them, and they're marching around the house, mine, 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 gimme, 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 right? Like, the reason we call it the terrible twos, well, these people literally are like 42 years old with the emotional maturity of a 2-year-old in their emotional and relationship realm. They may be doing fine at work. They've got other maturity levels that are in place that keep them functioning. But the emotional side is really stuck because those needs were so completely unmet in infancy that's what they're coming around. And that's why it's so hard, because basically they are demanding of people in their environment that they would meet their needs the way a 2-year-old demands that their needs be met. Now at 2, we get it. We're like, okay, you're 2, we'll meet your needs because you're 2 and you're going to grow out of this. But no adult can function with an adult the emotional neediness of a 2-year-old. So that's why it's so resistant to change. And so that's the kind of thing that happens. It's really just these unmet needs from infancy.
Okay, you're bringing me to so many new questions that I didn't expect to have, but I gotta ask because this is just so interesting for me, and I know that it is for the audience, obviously, if they're watching this show. So, borderline personality disorder. What exactly are the traits, and are they commonly attracted to narcissists?
Yeah, I haven't looked at BPD in a long time, but the traits are that they're very black and white thinking. It's all or nothing. So they love you or they hate you. Again, it's very classic that a girl, like, let's say it's two friends and they meet in college, and the one friend is just loves this new friend, and the other friend is like, okay, you're really sweet, but it becomes, instead of just being a normal friendship that develops, it becomes, oh my gosh, let's hang out every day. And then the boundaries, very porous boundaries. So a normal friendship, you meet someone, you're like, oh yeah, let's hang out. And it kind of builds, right? You hang out one night, a couple days go by, you hang out again, just a normal trajectory of the friendship building. The BPD, she wants all of you all the time and has weird flare-ups, gets jealous. Like if you're like, oh yeah, I went to the mall with Sarah. What? Mm-hmm. I didn't know you were going to the mall. Why wasn't I invited to the mall? Well, I was just hanging out with Sarah. We just, like, on the spur of the moment, decided to go to the mall. What? We always go to the mall. I can't believe you went with anyone else. Like, crazy rage, jealousy, the way that almost you'd expect of, like, a lover who would be, a boyfriend would be jealous because you spent time with another guy or something. So it's that kind of stuff. And it's very, it's so emotionally draining. I've had friendships. I wouldn't say they were BPD because I don't know. Have you had something like that?
I have, yeah, very early on as a teenager. But, yeah, and now that you're saying that, I didn't really, I didn't know enough about it at the time to identify it at all. But, yeah, definitely that dynamic. And it's pretty scary. They, like you said, they want to monopolize all of your energy, all of your time. And it's shocking, especially if you've never experienced it before. And it sounds to me like they lack a sense of identity within themselves when they attach themselves to yours.
That's exactly it. I'm glad you said that because, like I said, I haven't looked at the criteria in a long time, and I know the most recent DSM has changed. When I was in school, because the DSM changes every couple of years, and the way that they're diagnosing is slightly different, and I'm not sure what it looks like now, but identity is very porous. And so they are drawn to people who they have a sense that have a strong identity, and they run like the llama on, and they want your energy. They wish that they had that. And then people who have a strong identity, maybe they see this person needs a friend. They're coming at it with like, oh, she needs a friend. She's sweet. I'll be friends with her. And then all of a sudden it's like, what did I get myself into?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Wow. Interesting stuff. So jumping around a bit, but back to relationships. So what can you do if you see a friend or a family member in an abusive or a toxic relationship?
Yeah, I mean, you could stage an intervention if you wanted to. I hate to say it, but it's really very hard because when people are in that place where they don't have the clarity of what they're doing, like we talked about, they just haven't had that, they haven't gone to therapy or they haven't read their self-help books. They've just been putting an autopilot. They're going to be very protective of that relationship because they need it so badly, even though it's so unhealthy. So I'm a big fan of absolutely, grabbing a friend and saying, let's grab dinner, and then trying to just move the conversation to say, sometimes when I see you and whoever it is, like I get concerned because I see that, he doesn't treat you very well, but we've all been there, right? Haven't you had a girl call you up, your girlfriend, and you go out for a drink and she's crying because he broke up with her, and she's like, you know what? He treated me bad. And you're like, that's right, girl. He treated you bad. And I didn't tell you when you were dating, but he did this and this and this, and I didn't think that was cool. And then 2 days later, she's back with him, and now you're the bad guy.
Yeah.
Right.
That's an unfortunate dynamic, and it's so common.
Yeah. It's so common. We've all been there. So I mean, I've been burned by that. So I hesitate. When I see people. It's hard. I mean, it's really hard because people, they're just not, if they are just so needy of that relationship, even when it's toxic, they're not going to have ears to hear or eyes to see. So I always say, do it, give it a chance, try to say it in love, frame it in the way that you hope that they can hear it. Say it, I'm saying this because I love you and I care about you, but I wouldn't have the highest expectations for that. I really wouldn't.
Mhm. I had a family member once relate it to a drug addiction. So, when you keep going back to an abuser or a toxic relationship, let's say the person's not extremely abusive, but it's abusive and it's toxic, and you have a fight and you go your separate ways for a bit and you go back, that's kind of like that same addiction. It's like you're going back for the dopamine hit,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And your post spoke to that, some of the neural connections that are formed. And, the brains of kids who've been through trauma, there is research that shows that the neurotransmitters may not be, their neural pathways may not be, they've been wired differently because they've experienced so much trauma. Now, I say this with hesitation because people get really confused about neuroplasticity and neural pathways because we have a lot of misinformation. This goes into another direction, but it's related. So
okay, great.
And but so we have a lot of misinformation right now because of pharmaceutical companies who want to sell us drugs. So if you feel that you're depressed, they're going to tell you have a neurochemical imbalance, which is just not true. The research doesn't prove it. The research that they pump out is oftentimes funded by their own companies, and so they want to show that drugs work, whereas therapy actually works and is more sustainable, and the drugs oftentimes don't work. And you've seen this. They're like, if you're SSRI, that's the Prozac, or you're Abilify. Oh, not Abilify, rather. But if you're SSRI, Wellbutrin, those are for antidepressants, right? If they're not working, then take this other drug on top of it. It's called Abilify.
Right.
It's an antipsychotic. And people don't know it's an antipsychotic that you would give someone with schizophrenia, where they are literally out of touch with reality. They see things that no one else sees. They hear voices. And they're giving people who are depressed. And, yeah, it's scary. And half the time, these people are depressed because they went through a breakup or their grandmother died. Like this is going back to my former point. That's normal. You should feel depressed. It would be abnormal if you didn't feel depressed, right? So I have a lot of – I get very concerned about this information about neurotransmitters because it can be skewed to, getting back to the point here, it can be skewed to suggest that you have a neurological chemical imbalance and that is why you are feeling this, or that is why you are in relationships, right? Because you went through trauma as a kid and so you have a messed up brain, and that is not true. Yes, your brain may be firing differently because here's the thing. A brain is very much, it's not a muscle, but the neural pathways operate like a muscle such that if I keep thinking negative thoughts, those neural pathways become very strong. And neural pathways to positive thinking become very weak. So it becomes my default mode. It becomes very easy for me to think negatively. It's because there are synapses, there's connections between neuron to neuron that have been formed in a strong manner. But as much as I can think in a more negative way or a more positive way, I can take charge of my thoughts. I absolutely can. If I start thinking more positively, those neural pathways will become stronger. So that will be my default mode now. So getting back to the toxic relationship and all of the things we've been talking about today, even if you've been through trauma as a child, the solution is not to go hop yourself up on a ton of drugs because you're not psychotic. So I don't know why you would be taking an antipsychotic, which is I get furious at the pharmaceutical corporations. It drives me crazy. But the reality is, yes, your brain has been wired in a way, or like you said, the trauma bond, there's been some wiring that is not helping you, but you can rewire it. It's called neuroplasticity. I have a podcast episode about it. It's called Neuroplasticity is Your Superpower, and I go into more depth about it. And one of the things you do is you absolutely just put yourself in front of positive messaging. Whether it's like, for me, it's Joel Osteen. I love him. He's like this pastor that's got all these positive messages. And it really helped me through some of the worst painful breakups of my life because I kept going, nope, I'm going to have hope. I'm going to have faith. I'm going to have belief. And the other thing I want to tell listeners about this, too, that say they've been through a rough childhood and they've experienced toxic dynamics in their childhood and they see that they're carrying these into their adulthood, find someone, whether it's through Instagram, whether it's through a podcast, whether it's through people, if you don't have a lot of people in your community, tough because we're on lockdown, but find people who you go, you know what? I like their life. I see their relationship. It seems healthy. I want to aspire to that. And reach out to them and be like, I need a mentor. I need someone, because I come from such dysfunction that I don't know what healthy relationships look like. And when you talk to these people, they're going to speak into you hope, belief, faith. new ways of looking at the world. They're going to speak into you positively. That's going to help your brain start to rewire. It truly will. It has no other option. Whatever you put into it's like your body, right? Keep feeding yourself junk food, and your body's going to perform like junk. You feed yourself positive messaging, your brain will start performing in a positive way. It will rewire itself. It's the most beautiful thing it's the most hope-inspiring and positive message that I have for your audience, is that you can rewire your brain. Do not be told, because the pharmaceutical companies would love for you to be on drugs for the rest of your life. They absolutely would. Do not fall prey to that.
I love that advice. It's so true as well. You know, we go through things and then we think that there's no hope for us or we need to stay stuck there, but there's so many options and they're literally at our fingertips with the internet. You know, just to change the vibe of your day. And, you know, if you listen to meditation music with binaural beats, it changes the physiological response in your body and your brain to vibrate at a different frequency. So if you keep doing that and, flood yourself with meditation, like guided meditations or happy sounding music, get outside, get your endorphins pumping, get yourself moving even when it's hard, you know, it has an effect. It has a positive effect. Unlike a lot of these drugs that you're talking about, they sometimes make things worse after a while. Like look at Xanax, for example. Xanax is one of those, I feel like it's just so highly addictive, and it might work short term, but it's addictive and it can backfire on you later. So I feel like the more naturally you can do it, better. I'm not saying that there aren't people that need medication, okay? I'm just saying.
Yeah, I'm not saying that either, and I'm not. And I should say also, if you are on something, do not just like bounce off it, because your body is now adjusted to it. So actually, if anyone is concerned about this topic at all, I would like to direct you to another podcast episode that I had. I was able to interview. I was so honored to interview Dr. Alan Francis. He's a psychiatrist, so he's a medical doctor. I'm a psychologist, so I have a PhD, but I'm a psychologist, so I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a therapist and developmental psychologist. But he is a medical doctor. He actually chaired the steering committee for the DSM-4, which is the one right before this DSM-5. So he is coming from a medical background, and he is very concerned, for all the reasons you and I just talked about, that we are overprescribing. People are getting medications for just having normal parts of being a human, right? You're going to have ups and downs. It's called being human. And he wrote the book, Is Anybody Normal? And that's Saving Normal is what his book is called. And my podcast interview with him is called Is Anybody Normal? And I want to direct anyone to him because he is an expert in this. I'm not an expert. I'm a psychologist. I have my opinions about it, but he is a medical doctor expert. And he would say, do not just bounce off your Prozac if you're on it. If you want to start weaning yourself off, he would absolutely encourage that, but be responsible with it. And, of course, he's also saying, like you and I are saying as well, Jessica, some people have severe schizophrenia. I mean, these are severe diagnoses. There is a place for medicine, absolutely. I'm not a Scientologist. I'm not saying that it's never a place. But where we are right now is that the average person there's what's called diagnostic inflation. The average person is thinking that normal responses to normal realities of the day-to-day existence are pathological. We've pathologized them. And it behooves Big Pharma because they want to make money and tell us we're all mentally ill and like be on Xanax for the rest of our lives. So that I want to make that distinction. But anyone who really wants to learn more, that book is amazing. It's called Saving Normal, An Insider's Revolt Against Big Pharma, DSM-5, and the Medicalization of Everyday Life. I love that, the medicalization. Like everything is medicalized. It's like, actually, no. I mean, like we talked to earlier, the point of right now, we all feel a little off because it's a crazy time we're living in. So that kind of, to that, he's a brilliant, I was so honored to have him on my podcast. I just want to direct people that way because I don't want anyone listening to this and being like, oh, Dr. Karin said I should get off my Prozac, and then they go off, and then they're coming at me. And I don't need a lawsuit, Jessica.
Of course. You clarified it, so we're good. But,
good.
I love that topic, though, and I actually wrote a film about that. It was about, surrounding the opiate epidemic, actually, so a little bit of a different spin. But, yeah, and we were actually supposed to be filming the series in end of March, April, but obviously coronavirus interrupted us. But yeah, it surrounds that entire concept. So I feel like it's just still such a massive issue with the pharmaceutical companies really pushing the drugs instead of other therapies that, may work before resorting to that. And so just to clarify once more, there are cases where the drugs are needed, the pharmaceuticals are needed, but not always. And if you can detour around it, it's better for you because they have side effects. They have, it's addictive, some of them. So I like that. That approach. And obviously that's why I'm into the hypnosis and the NLP because, like you said, there are ways to rewire the brain without having to take pharmaceuticals. But you're more of the expert on this. So let me ask you this.
It sounds like NLP has some similar strategies. So, yeah, I'm excited to learn more. Real quickly before you ask, though, I want to know, have you read the book Dreamland?
I haven't even heard of it.
Okay. I actually interviewed the author. He's going to be on my podcast in a couple of weeks. And the reason I asked is because it's all about the opioid addiction throughout America. It's fascinating. Oh, my gosh. So I can't wait for you to produce your film because it's so important that we get this information out there, that it's touching everyone. And then it's connected to heroin because people they move from their prescriptions to heroin a lot. And I don't know if you delved into that with your film.
Absolutely. Fentanyl, heroin, all of it. So I actually filmed the sizzle, which is like the 10-minute version of the concept of the project in my hometown where I actually lost a lot of people, even family members, to it. So I've seen firsthand how, as a young adult or even a teen, the kid, they'll dabble in pills and think it's no big deal, but it quickly escalates into a really nasty drug addiction. And the next thing you know, they can't get any more pills, and the pills are expensive on the streets, so the drug dealers push heroin. And now it's mostly fentanyl, which is completely unpredictable, obviously, right? So the series actually revolves around all of that whole and how carfentanol is imported from China. Carfentanol is like 5,000 times strong. It's just crazy, yeah.
Oh my gosh. No, I
can't wait to check out that book.
Oh my gosh, I was riveted, and it's fascinating. He tells exactly why, and I was so concerned because when I was little, you'd hear heroin. It was like these inner city jazz musicians dabbled in heroin. It was like this very kind of out there drug that just a very fringe faction of society was involved with. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, a high school quarterback, he's a heroin addict. I'm like, what? And it's in these rural communities and small town. Oh my gosh, and it's still happening. So yeah, I'm glad that you are bringing some light to that. And I'm so sorry to hear that you've had personal experience with folks just getting caught up with that and losing their lives. I'm so sorry to hear that.
Thank you. It's such a rampant problem still. The research that I was doing about a year ago, we were speaking at, my partner in that, Gerald Barclay, he's an amazing director, but we were speaking at colleges and screening that 10-minute version, talking to students. And, the research that we were doing at that time revealed, there were places in the U.S. that they couldn't accommodate families at the funeral homes. There were too many deaths from overdoses. That's how bad it was. It was like West Virginia, I think, at the time.
Yeah.
But, it's still a major issue. But now we have coronavirus on top of it. So that's
there you go.
to make it even worse.
Yeah.
But, yeah. So what type of so the book that you have out, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, my book is called Single is the New Black, Don't Wear White Till It's Right, and it is a word of encouragement and empowerment to singles. It's all about all these things that you hear when you're single for a long time, which I didn't get married until I was 42, so I heard it all, right? I was too picky. I was too opinionated. I probably should tone it down a notch because no guy could handle me. You're getting a PhD. They'll all be intimidated by you. And I was like, the guy's intimidated by me. He's not my guy. Okay, right?
Yeah.
I mean, all this stuff that women hear. And so I basically take issue with all of them and remind us what we know down deep is true, that we're not just trying to be in a relationship to be in a relationship. We're waiting for our person. We're waiting for a strong, extraordinary, fantastic relationship. And if that doesn't come along for a while, some people meet their person young, and some people meet them later. Life just happens the way it happens. So it's just all about just reminding us all. And it's interesting because, and I talk a little bit, it's more like meant to be just a shot in the arm, because sometimes the single shaming can get, people get down, or they start worrying if they're going to be alone for forever. And I share some little therapeutic techniques here and there, but it's more meant to be just a fun self-help book. But I do talk about research out of the University of Toronto that came out in 2013 that shows that the fear of being single is predictive of being, what we know is true, that if you're scared of being single, you're more likely to be in a very lackluster, mediocre relationship. You're less likely to leave a relationship even when you admit that it's unsatisfying and you're not that into them. And you're also, the researchers found that you're also more likely to consider dating someone who you're not that excited about just because you're like, well, it's better than being single. And so my platform and my message is like, no, it's not better to be in a boring, mediocre, or like we've been talking about today, toxic and abusive relationship. It's better to be single. And as we talked about today as well, it's a great time. Your single years are a great opportunity to sort yourself out, to become strong and independent, so that when you have that relationship, it's out of choice, not out of need, because you want to be with someone. You don't need to be with someone. So, yeah, the book is just, it's girl power.
Amazing. I still need to read your book, so that's definitely next on my list. And then Dreamland, I think, is going to have to be my next one.
Yes. And my book, since you brought it up, I'm actually, my audio version is going to be coming out in the middle of May. And I'm going to do a little bit of tweaking to the book. It's actually the 5-year anniversary of its publication, and I'm going to tweak a little bit because in the last 5 years, literally I published it in May of 2015, and then Tinder showed up like right around that time. So I feel like a book single and the dating scene and doesn't touch on Tinder at this point is not working. So I'm going to just tweak a little bit, but everything else, maybe find a couple of research studies to slip in just because I'm a psych nerd. I got to throw in a little bit of that. But for the most part, the book will stay the same, but the audio version is going to come out, which is exciting because I've had a lot of people ask for that, which I also like to listen to books on Audible. So I was like, okay, you got to get your act together and get your audio book. But I've been so busy with my podcast and other things that I hadn't had a chance to do it yet.
That's amazing. We got to roll with the time. Yeah. So a little tweaking is a good thing sometimes, right?
Yes, exactly. And Jessica, I have another book coming out in the fall, and that is about when I called off my first engagement. When I was 34, I was engaged, and I called off my wedding 2 months before the wedding. So I met this guy at 30. We dated for 3 years. We were engaged for a year, and 2 months before I realized that I was in the engagement for the wrong reasons, and he was not my person, and I should not be marrying him. And so I talk about all that because when I was in an engagement that was, I was confused. I was unsure. I was having cold feet, but I was like, am I unrealistic about what I should be feeling as an engaged woman? And so I went to the self-help section, and there's very few resources for women who may be in a relationship, whether they're engaged or even just having dated someone for a long time. There are very few resources for them to help them sort out their emotions. Like, is this the right relationship? Do I need to get out? So that book is going to be coming out in the fall.
That's amazing, and I knew about that story from following you, actually.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure.
Yep. And I'm glad that you mentioned it, that the book is coming out, and I think that takes such a self-reflective and strong person to be able to recognize that before going through with it, because a lot of people would just go through with it anyway and be like, oh, well, like they settle, like you said, because they don't want to be single or they want to be married, but doing it for the wrong reasons is detrimental to your happiness in the long run, right? So, and I know that you're, really happy now, so that's amazing.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's like a lot of us. I mean, I know we try to go, okay, what have I learned? how can I help someone else not make the mistakes I want to catch everyone. Don't get engaged when he proposes. You're going to know in your gut if it's right or wrong, and listen to your gut. And, so I'm just out here trying to share my story, hoping that I can help some others avoid the mistakes I made and inspire them to believe in themselves and know that they are worth an extraordinary relationship. There's just no point in getting married unless it's just the best. There's just no point, because people talk about, the ball and chain, and marriage is so hard, it's so much work, and I can tell you, if you marry the right person, it is pretty darn easy.
That's amazing. I love that you just said that. So important for people to hear that. And our perspective going into it as well is going to affect the relationship. So if you don't feel 100%, and like you said, if that's not your person, you can feel that. And the feeling that you have going into it is going to set a tone for the entire marriage, right? So I think that's
so true.
Can't wait to hear it. I can't wait to read that book. I wanted to talk to you about one more thing while I have you on. So emotional triggers. Triggers are another one of these topics that are being talked about like all over the social media outlets right now, right? So how would you describe a trigger, and how do you identify what they are, and what do you do about them?
Yeah, I mean, trigger, you're right. It's a word that just has become real. I first heard of the word trigger, and it was in the context of, like, trigger warnings at universities, where a professor, and I was reading this article, and then I read the book about it, which is also an amazing book, The Coddling of the American Mind. It's so good. But this article was in The Atlantic, and it was back in, I think it was like 2015. And they were talking about how a professor, like a law professor, when he was talking about in his lecture, like if someone violated the law, that he would have to warn his students. So anyone who may have been violated in any way, shape, or form in their past might get triggered if he said the word, I'm going to talk about violating the law, which to me sounded like two different things. Like, to have been sexually violated would have been horrible, but when we're talking about violating the law, that could be like jaywalking, so, but it was this interesting, so it was this interesting reality the universities were starting to face, because the kids were like, I got triggered when I heard that word violated. And I was like, oh my gosh. So that's where it first came across my radar. So I don't know that it's a psychological term per se. I think it's just a term that people are now kind of using to describe just getting something that happens in the current setting or scenario that is throwing you back to some other trauma or some other painful place, and you're getting tripped up in the current moment based on it. You just got reminded, essentially,
like
of what happened.
It, like, and you kind of relive the previous experience. That's the relation I'm getting from the way that the word's been used. And is that a thing? Because I know there's a gland in the brain. I think it's called the amygdala. You're the expert on this. But there's the neurotransmitter, from what I understand, and I could be wrong, but you can clarify, is triggered, one area of the brain. It sends a neurotransmitter to make you relive an experience emotionally that you've already lived. So, I just wanted to clarify that, because I find it really interesting.
Yeah, and again, I don't know where this is housed in the brain. What I can tell you from the cognitive literature is a state-dependent memory. And it's so if I'm mad, and I could get mad at someone who, road rage, right? Someone who cuts me off in traffic. When I'm mad, I'm more likely to pull up memories from my past when I've also been mad, right? Because I'm in the same state. So the memory is more accessible based on my current emotional state, that memory. And you can think about, like, you get mad at something, then you're like, and another thing, and I'm mad about the thing happened yesterday, and I'm mad about you can see you start swelling, right? And all of a sudden you're more and more. I don't know, and I'm not saying that it's not what you just described is not it. I just don't know if there is some sort of brain mechanism, because the brain is so complex. So we try to simplify it to make sense of it, but really a lot of things are housed in different portions of the brain. There's certainly like even something like memory. There's different locations the memory is going to, there's parts of the memory that are going to be in a certain area of the brain. There's parts that are going to be in some other part of the brain. It's not quite as compartmentalized as we talk about it. And a brain expert would have to, but I'm not saying that what you said isn't true. That could be it. Actually, I'm going to go research it after we talk because now you got me curious. I'm really curious. But, I mean, yeah, we can relive something, but, you know, like a flashback. I mean, and this comes from trauma like PTSD, right? That's essentially, you know, folks, the veterans, these guys would come back. You know, it was first came across the awareness in the psych community with Vietnam. These guys would come back and they did a tour in Vietnam, and then they're walking down the street and they hear a car backfire, which sounds like a shot, right? Like a gunshot. Mm-hmm. And they are like throwing themselves down on the deck. They're like hitting the deck, right? Because they're scared, because they're basically, their body went into the physiological response of saving themselves. So they're trying to run for cover. Well, it wasn't a gun. In this case, it was a car backfiring. So they're having this very visceral response and behaving in a way as if they were back in that Vietnam scenario. So PTSD would be related to this. So when you talk about trigger, I guess to me there's a continuum, and it would just depend on how intense the emotional trauma had been and how intense the current state is. But people do feel, but they'll say like, he triggered me. I'm like, okay, but well, I'm not even sure what they mean by that. Like someone asked me recently, they're like, well, your husband triggers you. I was like, it was in an interview too, and I was like, well, I don't think he triggers me. In that case, they just meant, what does he do that makes me mad or irritates me? So I'm not really sure about, there's like a continuum, like we've been talking about it. And a lot of things, there's a continuum. So are you talking about where someone would have almost like a PTSD reaction?
Well, I definitely talk about PTSD a lot on my show, especially because I talk a lot about abuse and trauma. So I understand it on that level. And I know that people can relive an experience due to a circumstance that reminds them of something that happened to them before. And it can seem a lot more intense because they're reliving something that they had been through that was traumatic from the past. But the emotional triggers, like you just pointed out, where somebody's like, well, your husband triggers you, right? So, how is that being approached in like couples therapy, for example? Like everything seems to be like, well, he triggered me, well, she triggered me. And it's like, well, you need to know what my triggers are.
Yeah.
It's a really common conversation. So at what level do we give that, credibility or seriousness? I guess that's the question. But the original statement that I was saying about the gland in the brain and the neurotransmitter, I think that's from a book that I read. I'm not even like exaggerating, like 20 years ago, approximately 20 years ago. It was called Emotional Intelligence. I'm pretty sure that's where I read that. But, like I said, I don't know enough about it, but in couples therapy, is that something that is discussed, like having to know what each other's triggers are? And how valid is it? That was kind of my question.
Yeah, I mean, in couples therapy, I'm not really sure if that would be. I'm sure they would discuss it. I don't know in what way they would discuss it. So it would be the kind of thing to know your partner, to know what sets them off, I think is important. And it's, to me, and again, I'm not talking about PTSD here. I'm not talking about like massive trauma. I'm talking about like trigger, like something that just irritated you, right? Like in this case, I guess I just want to make a distinction between someone who's been through something and then someone who's going to get triggered by the toilet seat being left up, right? Or something like that. I mean,
that's what I mean, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think that in that case, I personally wouldn't use the word trigger for that. And I would probably, if I were seeing a couple, I would probably encourage them to maybe, let's dial it down, because that word, I would reserve that for a legit trigger, like you were talking about, right? Or a more of a PTSD kind of episode where someone was really pulled out of the here and now and into that emotional state from 20 years ago or something. That would, I think, is more useful to keep that term for that. But but yeah, because otherwise, it's to me, an explanation is not an excuse. So if I were working with a couple, or even in my own life, if I go, like, because if you're married, let's say that your husband did something that your ex-boyfriend used to do. All of a sudden, he did something, I can't even think of an example, but he did something, you're like, ugh, I'm triggered. My ex used to do that, right? Well, I mean, maybe have the conversation, but then he's going to try to adjust his behavior, because if it's something little and inconsequential, he's going to adjust his behavior because he doesn't want to set you off. But also, like, you have to, again, if it's something more basic or banal, then, own your response and don't let yourself be triggered. But I'm not trying to talk about something that's really severe, because that sounds insensitive. But I just mean in the day-to-day with a couple, if I'm going to let myself be triggered by something here and now that my ex did, it's time for me to let go of the ex business. Whatever energy I'm holding on to my ex, let that go, because that's not helpful it's not building into, and it's not edifying my relationship now.
That's a really good point, and I think it's great advice as well. And if somebody is triggering actual traumatic things that you've been through, then that's not a healthy relationship, and you need to get out of it. But if there are triggers, like you said, like he's annoying me, he's leaving the toilet seat up, or he's not putting the cap on the toothpaste, those aren't triggers to me. And the reason I bring it up is because all of these terms are being thrown around a lot lately, and I'm exploring them still, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of them. So it's interesting for me to hear which ones are the valid terms, like in actual psychology or therapy, and which ones are just being tossed around lightly and, given a much deeper meaning, when really, like you said, maybe you need to let go of some things as well. So I'm all about self-reflection and self-work and, self-evolution.
Yeah. Well, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because I too, like I said, the first time that term came across my radar, it was in conjunction with the university campus kind of culture with the trigger warnings and all this. So I thought, okay, where is this going? But and I was kind of like you, I'm kind of following this term and going, wow, it's really infiltrated our vernacular now. And then words are powerful, and I want to be very careful using words, that we make sure that we are, and I'm just an advocate, and clearly it's come up several times in our conversation, I'm an advocate for empowering us. And if I go, well, that's going to trigger me, well, I'm giving a lot of power to something, right? I want to take the power back. I want to be in control of my responses. I don't want to be reactionary. I want to respond. And there's a distinction there. Reaction is just knee-jerk reaction, and you're going to come out with heightened emotions and all sorts of things that could be very unhealthy for you and for your partner if we're in the relationship context. I want to respond. I want to be thoughtful. Like you said, I want to be introspective. I want to let go of things that aren't serving me, and that might be doing some work to explore whatever energy I need to let go of, so that I'm not triggered anymore, so that I can be in the here and now and be in this present moment, which is, of course, what the type of work that you do, I'm sure, with the meditation and hypnotherapy, being grounded in this present moment and reminding myself that in this moment I am safe and I am in control. And even with breathing, I love all that kind of stuff. I'm not super into all that personally, but I try to, but, like many people, it's hard to meditate because the mind gets going. It doesn't want to be quiet.
It takes practice, and it has to be something that it has to work for you. It's not for everybody, and that's okay too. I'm always an advocate for, like, find the things that work for you. There's so many different outlets and tools that are accessible to us, and not everything works for everybody, and there's different paths to recovery. I believe for all different types of things, for recovering from trauma or addiction or mental health issues. I think there are a lot of different ways that we can go about it, but it's a matter of taking power, wanting to take power back of your mind, of your life, of saying, I don't want to feel like this anymore. I don't want to feel like a victim. I don't want to feel depressed. I want to take control back of me, and the only way you can do that is by finding the things that work for you. And I think that's why people get so stuck sometimes, is they just accept like the cards that they were dealt, or, you know, like you were saying earlier, it's like, oh, well, this happened to me in my childhood, so this is what my life is going to be like. It has to be a conscious decision, but you have to make an effort to change what's happening in the subconscious for it to actually be effective. So that's why I love having you on today, because you're all about that, you know, about taking power back, of looking at yourself. Why did I attract that? Why am I, you know, drawn to this type of person? Or why can't I be comfortable and confident with being single until I find the person for me? So all of these things, you know, I just find it very empowering, and I just want to keep spreading that message out there of taking control back of your life and your mind, especially your thoughts.
Yes, I love it. We definitely have a lot of synergy here. We're very like-minded. So, it's been a real treat to talk with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for being on. I've been following you, like I said, for, you know, a couple years now, and I always love your posts. And then I started this show, and I was like, wow, Dr. Karin is perfect. So thanks for joining us, and I would love to have you on again. You know, I'm sure there's many topics we could discuss, but
oh my gosh. Yeah, thank you. No, I would come on anytime. I love what you're about. I want to learn more about NLP. Like I said, you got to come on my programs and teach people about NLP and hypnosis. And so, I would anytime. I really enjoyed our conversation. It was a lot of fun, and it felt like we covered a lot of ground, but there's more to cover for sure.
Definitely. I can't wait to read your book. Well, both of your books, actually. So if you want to let everybody know just the names of them one more time and where they can find you on social media or your website, any of that before we close out.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Yeah, I'm most active on Instagram. It's where Jessica and I connected. I'm at Dr. Karin. It's dr.karin. And then I'm on Facebook a little bit and Twitter. Dr. Karin Anderson Abrell on Facebook, and Dr. Karin Anderson, because I wasn't married yet when I started my Twitter account. And of course, all with an IN. And my website is loveandlifemedia.com, because my podcast is called Love and Life, and that's what I talk about. It's lively conversations grounded in psych research to help us all thrive in love and life. So I cover the gamut. Tons of dating, relationship, marriage stuff for sure. But I also, like you guys heard today, I weave in stuff about pharmaceutical corporations impacting the psychological field. I talk about parenting sometimes. We talk about all kinds of empowering topics just to keep people thriving in love and life. And my book is Single is the New Black, Don't Wear White Till It's Right. And I think my next book, the working title is I Don't, because I didn't. So, but yeah.
Excellent.
So, yeah. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And, stay tuned, guys, for another episode with Dr. Karin, of course. And thanks for joining us today. And we will see you guys tomorrow. Bye, Dr. Karin.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today on A Billion Realities. Please stay tuned for next Wednesday's show at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time or 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Take care, everyone.